Good morning, Madam Chairman, Dr. the Honorable Keith Rowley, Member for Parliament. Conference organizers and presenters, distinguished guests, conference participants, members of the media, ladies and gentlemen. I think I couldn't say it better than to say that this conference is certainly well timed in its intent and certainly its subject matter, if only because over the last couple of weeks I myself have been involved in what was a fairly public procurement process. And I note in particular your last session yesterday afternoon, which dealt with the balancing act inherent in considering issues relating to the confidentiality of information, sensitive business information, personal information, and privileged information, which of course ought not to be the front page of the press every morning. So, and of course there are public policy laws which do allow access to information. Invariably that is allowed after the decisions have been made. The government of Trinidad and Tobago acknowledges that effective procurement practices are an essential component of good corporate governance, and an effective procurement mechanism is also a prerequisite for the successful implementation of various projects designed to ensure that Trinidad and Tobago attains the developed country status that we are now embarked upon. The state is a major purchaser of goods and services in any market, and even more pronounced in a relatively small market such as Trinidad and Tobago. In this context, public procurement has a tremendous impact on the economic, social, political, and legal environment, and therefore common sense suggests that the state has to ensure that procurement systems guarantee value for money and an efficient allocation of resources. The Honorable Minister of Finance, Madam Karen Teixeira, yesterday indicated government strategies for the sector, which will focus on strengthening central and local government procurement systems, including state enterprises. And I will speak a little bit more of that and some of the techniques which we are currently used. There is abroad clearly a misunderstanding of exactly how state enterprises operate, and the feeling that we lack procedures, and that is clearly not the case. The country's demand for goods and services has increased, as has public expectations. The economy has grown substantially in the last 3 years, and there's an increasing awareness of the need to improve delivery both in terms of quality and quantity. And we live in a world where the public travels more and sees more of the world through television and therefore expects more. And these expectations have been heightened by the relatively strong rate of growth that we've experienced over the last few years. But the principles on which any procurement policy must be based are simple: transparency, accountability, efficiency, balanced by the need for privileged information to be kept confidential until it is no longer privileged. These requirements will not change and must be the bedrock on which any change in the existing systems must be anchored. Dr. Rowley spoke of the Central Tenders Board. And just by amplification, the Central Tenders Board since 1961 established the Act established the operations and procedures of the Central Tenders Board. The stated intention then was for the Central Tenders Board to be the sole agency responsible for government procurement. And that process involves, in summary, ministry or department submission of the relevant documents, who then administer the tendering process. Since 1961, not only has there been increased demand, but also greater expectations of efficiency in the delivery of such goods and services. In other words, the Central Tenders Board's procedures have tended to be a bit slow, and there are very specific areas in which the Central Tenders Board fails to deliver exactly what is required. In meeting the challenges of increased demand and the expectations, adjustments have been made to the Central Tenders Board framework as a result. In 1987, provisions were allowed or added for government to procure goods and services without the involvement of the Central Tenders Board in the event of an emergency. In 1991, the Act was amended to allow for special ministerial tender committees to procure arms, ammunition, equipment for the Defense Force and the protective services, and that continues to be the case. In 1993, an amendment validated the National Insurance Property Development Company, NIPDEC, as a procurement agency for governments outside of the ambit of the Central Tenders Board. State enterprises are very much part and parcel of that amendment, or that change or move away from the Central Tenders Board, in an effort to promote the timely implementation of projects. Well, certainly it's an effort, we may not always achieve it, and the delivery of services without compromising the accountability and transparency aspects of the Central Tenders process. Special purpose vehicles were established to implement and manage special projects. And I noticed that there are a number of you who represent some of the special projects or state enterprises here today. Now, those state enterprises are also governed by a number of other pieces of legislation, not the least of which are the Companies Act, Integrity in Public Life Act, which was passed in 2000, the Prevention of Corruption Act, the Freedom of Information Act, the Constitution Amendment, Parliamentary Committee Acts, which of course also caused a little stir, both in the press and in Parliament on Friday, those of you who were looking. There's also some measure of control is also allowed through the Exchequer Act and the financial regulations which are attached there too, which also influence the operation of the state enterprises. Both the state enterprises and other state and special purpose vehicles have been allowed and in fact mandated to adopt the Central Tenders Board process in-house. So it is not to say that the Central Tenders Board has been completely vitiated or bypassed. The actual process, which is mirrored in the Central Tenders Ordinance, exists in the state enterprises. The in-house process, unless otherwise approved by the Ministry of Finance, allows contracts to be awarded in accordance with what we now call the standard procurement procedures for the acquisition of goods and services to be provided and works to be undertaken for the for the disposal of unserviceable items in state enterprises and or statutory bodies or state agencies. These procedures were developed by the Ministry of Finance and include the following requirements: the establishment of a tenders committee on which there must be 2 board members, a pre-qualification committee shall be established and contractors should be pre-qualified. The tenders committee shall also invite and consider tenders for the supply of goods and services or works as necessary for carrying out the objectives of the company. The avoidance of conflicts of interest, and there are fairly well-defined procedures for the avoidance of conflicts of interest. Tenders to be deposited in a box marked the tender deposit box, very much like the Central Tenders Board. A register of tenders to be submitted and maintained, which should record date, time, and the name of the person who delivered the tender. All tenderers to be invited for the opening of the tenders, and appeals by applicants who believe that they were unfairly treated in the tendering process, and the line minister's approval for the tendering rules as required. Also, all state enterprises are required to report monthly to the Ministry of Finance all awarded contracts over $5 million. While state enterprises and statutory bodies can adopt the Central Tenders process in-house, the Central Tenders Board remains the only procuring agency for central government, i.e. government, ministries and departments. And there are still a number of deficiencies, which I alluded to earlier. Under the law, the Central Tenders Board is not involved in the design phase of the procurement process. This has cost implications and impacts the ultimate usefulness of the tendering process. Invariably, many tenders do not meet all of the requirements as set out in the request for proposals, and there is some negotiation which is required post facto that clearly amends in many ways the whole process of tendering.